All right. Well, welcome, class. I'm super excited for our guest speaker, Vanessa, who is from the Family Place in Dallas, a really great organization if you're not familiar with them. But she's going to talk to us about intimate partner violence, and I'm hoping that this information will go along really well with your module on intimate partner violence. And I'm excited to learn from Vanessa today. So, Vanessa, it is all yours.
Great. Hi, all. You have disabled screen sharing. Can you
Oops.
enable that?
Yes, I did not mean to. So let me
All
see.
right.
How is that? Did that let you do it?
Yep, it is
Okay.
happy now. All right. Let me pull this up. Let me pull up the chat just in case anybody wants to throw something in there.
Yeah, and I think what if you're okay with this, if the rest of us can mute ourselves while you're talking, and then as there are questions that come up, do you prefer for them to go into the chat, or do you prefer for people to, raise their hand and ask you?
With so few of us on the call, just feel free to unmute yourself and shout out whatever question you may have. If you feel more comfortable putting it in the chat, I've got that pulled up, so that's there. But I don't mind being interrupted. I work with teenagers, so just
Yeah.
chime in whenever you like.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Great. All right. So, yes, my name is Vanessa. I am with the Family Place. I'll give you all a quick intro. The Family Place is Dallas's largest domestic violence provider. We provide shelter, counseling, hotline, all kinds of skill building options, education and community outreach work, part of which is my program, Be Project, where we work specifically in middle and high schools, educating about dating violence and working to prevent violence in youth, but also doing general community education around domestic violence as well. I'll hop into more in depth about our services in just a moment. I wanted to give you all a game plan. I had talked with Lisa about a number of things that we could cover today, and we would need like 3 class periods to do it all. So what we're going to do is get a little bit into she wanted me to talk about like how I got into this field, like what are those kind of avenues of entry. So we'll talk about that, family place services, and some kind of domestic violence, partner violence 101 info. And then we've got some more like spicy categories that, depending on time, y'all can pick what you'd like to discuss, whether we're looking at the groups of and types of people that are most at risk, or what makes violence happen, what makes a perpetrator. If you want to talk about the prevention end of things, which is my area of expertise, we can do that. If anybody like has kids and you want to know more about what this looks like with teens, we can do that. So we've got options. So for how I got here, kind of a strange route. I got my undergrad intending to do anthropology and archaeology work. I did a lot in urban farming, and I led school gardens, and in leading school gardens for some community agriculture, I really loved working with teenagers. It was just my favorite thing. And one day in my after school garden club, I had my boys, it was middle school, my boys were running around with yardsticks that we intended to use to measure seed spacing, and they were slapping the girls on the behind with the yardsticks. So we canceled all gardening activities for that day. And I was like, have y'all ever heard the word consent? We're going to talk about some things. So that was my first entry to this field, I would say, was when I just had to cancel the garden that day to talk about consent with my middle schoolers. And I loved that. I loved that so much. And I started looking at basically, how can I do that? I love farming and I love agriculture, but I really liked talking to teenagers about consent and about gender and about power and violence and all of those things, which kind of led me into getting my Master of Public Health. In the field of violence prevention, all of the kind of theories and frameworks and research that drives violence prevention comes from public health. So I knew that's where I wanted to go. For anyone unfamiliar, I think when we think about public health, we think about like our city water sanitation and the county health department that tracks COVID cases. But there's also the touchy-feely side of public health that's really just like community social work. And that is what I did. So in grad school, I did my master of public health, focused on adolescent health, sexual health, issues of violence and gender. And I worked for my university's Title IX office as well. While I was there as a grad student, we were in the middle of rewriting the policy, the Title IX policy for the campus. So that was basically my graduate internship, was rewriting that policy and making a more accessible and friendly website for Title IX, and making sure that everyone on campus was aware of all the protections afforded by Title IX. So that was my first kind of professional foray into this field. And I loved my time in Title IX. And then from there, I moved into what I'm doing now. I've worked in rape crisis centers. I now work in a domestic violence organization, The Family Place, and always doing prevention and education work. That's very much my passion, is on the prevention side of things, which, you know, the goal of us prevention folks is to work everybody else in the agency out of a job, right? We want to make it to where nobody needs those shelter beds and nobody has to call the hotline and things like that. So that's our ultimate goal. So I came here through way of public health, but a lot of people in this field have, you know, a degree in social work or criminal justice or psychology or sociology. We've got counseling, all kinds of things. So yeah, I think people kind of find themselves here often through social work, but also lots of other options bring folks to this field, which we love. So Family Place Services, want to get into all the different things that we offer. Like I mentioned, shelter, counseling, community engagement, all of those things. And we've been doing this for what is it, 40 years in Dallas, I believe. I think 1978 was when we started. Yeah, so a little over 45. We're 45 years. There we go. So this is our 45th year. So this is a crazy complicated chart. You don't need to commit this to memory, but it is a great way of understanding the huge variety of services that we offer for folks who have experienced partner violence. We think about this within kind of 3 categories of services, one being residential, this little bubble right here. That's everybody who's living with us. Then we've got non-residential. This is all the counseling, case management, all of that kind of work. And then we've got these community programs, which is where my program B Project exists. We've got our supervised visitation center, our batterers intervention. We'll get into all of those more in a minute, but this is kind of a helpful, I think, framework for understanding the 3 pieces of residential, non-residential, and community-based. So for our residential services, I haven't gotten to update 2022 numbers yet because we're still putting all that together. So I apologize. It's still going to be 2021 numbers. But we've got 3 different shelters that we run. 2 are for women and their children. 1 is for men and their children. We are one of only a handful of domestic violence agencies across the entire country that have a shelter for men. For men who are seeking shelter, often the only option is your kind of general homeless shelter, which is, of course, a shelter and a place to stay and, you know, a warm meal, but it doesn't include staff that are specially trained in domestic violence issues and know exactly what your unique needs are going to be. So we're really excited to be able to offer that shelter for men. We also have an animal shelter, which is another very, very, very unique feature for shelters across the country. And most places, understandably, you cannot bring your pets because folks have allergies, and it's not just you we have to think about, it's everybody staying with us. We have been able to separate those facilities in a way that folks who have allergies or who are living in the shelter are not interacting with animals unless they choose to. So they're 2 separate things, but housed in the same building. But we're really proud to have that animal kennel because pets can often be something that keep people from seeking shelter and getting to safety, which maybe sounds kind of silly if this is kind of the first time you're hearing about it, but oftentimes pets are involved in the abuse taking place in a home where the pets are being abused too, and nobody wants to leave their pet behind experiencing that abuse. Or there might even be threats of, if you leave me, I'll harm your dog, your cat, whoever. offer. So it's a really serious thing that keeps people from getting the help they need. And it's a really easy fix, right? If that's going to keep people from coming in, then let them bring their pets. So it's kind of a no-brainer for us that people should be able to bring them. And apart from keeping those pets safe and getting you into shelter, it's also like better for you to be able to have your pet with you and be able to have that comfort and that emotional support. So we're really, really proud of those services. Then for our clients who need that kind of extra time with us, we've got our supportive living program, which is transitional housing. So those are complete apartments that we have on site where they're totally self-sufficient in those apartments on their own, where we fully furnish it, all the things that they might need, and they can stay anywhere from 18 to 24 months in that program. Another thing we're really proud of is that high lethality cases are never turned away. And high lethality means the risk of that person being killed by their partner. So there's what's called a lethality assessment that can be done by law enforcement and done by hotline folks and things like that to determine what is the level of risk that this person is experiencing. And, do we need to get them into shelter right now? Is it that we often are fully, our beds are full, like many shelters everywhere. So sometimes we do have to turn folks away, unfortunately. We try to work around that as much as we can through partnerships with hotels and things like that, and working with other agencies to figure out, like, maybe I don't have a bed right now, but this one over here does. So we try to coordinate as best we can, but high lethality cases will never be turned away. We also have on-site medical and dental services for all of our clients, whether they're living with us or just receiving, counseling or case management services. So our two largest shelter locations both have those on-site clinics. We've got full-time clinic staff, as well as tons and tons of contracted nurses, doctors, dentists, specialists, all kinds of folks who can come in and provide specialized services if our clients need that, things that we wouldn't be able to just provide on a day-to-day basis. All the things on here are things that we can provide pretty regularly, don't need a ton of notice. We don't need to bring anybody in special. For basic first aid stuff, kids upstairs are sniffling, need to figure out what's going on. People need vaccinations, going back to school, routine dental cleaning, stuff like that. And then of course, if you need specialized services, we can always bring folks in, and everything's free in our clinics. You're not paying for that care. Yeah, on-site OBGYN stuff. Yeah, absolutely. That's a super, super big deal that we are thrilled to be able to offer, especially because we know that folks coming in to receive our services may have had a lapse in medical care. Maybe those kiddos haven't had a teeth cleaning in a while, and maybe you haven't had a pap smear in a while. So being able to provide those is also super important for free. It's here. There are almost no barriers to just, walk down the stairs, walk into the clinic, and receive the care you need. So we try to remove as many of those barriers as possible. So then on the non-residential side of our services, we've got all of our counseling and case management, things like that. So we provide counseling for children and adults, people of all genders. Everything is available in both English and Spanish. We can help with transportation assistance. Everything we do is free. Everybody is welcome. We just want to make sure that people are getting what they need. And so we offer both individual counseling as well as group counseling. And then of course, all of the case management services that goes along with that of just making sure that basic needs are being met. We have a pantry that's a part of our counseling center. So if you have hygiene items or canned goods and stuff like that could help out, we've got that for you. Help connecting to job opportunities or building some job skills, helping you with your resume, all of those types of things we can help with. So then for our community-based programs, that's where I am housed. We've got Faith and Liberty's Place, which is a supervised visitation center. This is for parents with custody arrangements where the parent who does not have custody of the children does have visitation rights, but the court has decided that it's not safe for those visitations to occur in private. They need to be monitored by trained professionals to make sure that that child or those children remain safe during that visitation. So Faith and Liberty's Place is where we have our staff who are, trained and on site to supervise those visitations between non-custodial parents and their children, just to make sure that nothing is being said that shouldn't be said, to make sure that everything is safe. We're really, really proud of that program. We also provide legal services. We do not have like an attorney on staff, but we have a legal assistant on staff who partners with us through Legal Aid of Northwest Texas, so that our clients do have access to attorneys if they need that, especially for things like custody arrangements and protective orders and things like that. We have our Batterers Intervention and Prevention Program, or BIP for short, and that is for our abusers. This is a court-mandated program for folks who have been charged, with a family violence, domestic violence kind of crime, and they have to attend what I believe is 30 weeks of classes. I might have that number a little off, but it is, almost a year of classes that you're attending once a week. You've got to be there. It is part of your, parole or probation. It is court mandated, and BIP programming is not clinical, it's not counseling, it's not therapy, but you can imagine it kind of like a group therapy program. It's psychoeducational, it's curriculum based, all about basically working with our batterers to identify like what are your own beliefs and personal experiences that have led you to behave in this way, and how can we start to reframe some of that, because we hopefully want these folks to never batter again, right? We want to help them just as much as we want to help their the people that they have harmed. We want to make sure that we are ending that cycle. We then have our domestic violence high risk team, DVHRT, and those are the folks keeping tabs on the abusers and the victims who are in that very high risk category of victims who are incredibly likely to be killed by their partner. A big thing that goes into determining a high risk category is the presence of strangulation as a part of that abuse. When strangulation is involved, it's immediately a high risk case. So that's something that we really keep tabs on, checking up with those victims, making sure that they have what they need, helping them get to safety if they have decided to leave that person, really, really doing kind of intensive work with those folks. We then have our Hispanic Advisory Council, who works to make sure that the Hispanic community in the Dallas area is aware of our services, is aware that we can provide our services in Spanish, is aware that our services are free, all of those things. And then the African American Domestic Violence Council was started just a couple of years ago to address the fact that Black women are experiencing really, really high domestic violence rates, especially here in Dallas, to kind of work with the community and figure out why is this a group that is particularly at risk, and what can we be doing to address that. And then finally, within the community initiatives, are my program B Project. This is where we work with our teens and with the adults who support teens. So we have a long-term curriculum that's implemented in health classes. So if you're a student taking health at one of our schools, you will see us every single week for almost the entire semester doing our violence prevention curriculum. We also have support groups for students who have been in an abusive relationship or maybe have a rough home situation. We do leadership development with our students, and we also do workshops for parents and teachers and any other youth serving professionals to educate them not only about teen dating violence, but about positive youth development in general. How can we be building stronger relationships with our teenagers? How can we create environments that keep our teenagers safe? Those kinds of things. Any questions about Family Place services before we move on?
Oh, Flo, I think you're on mute if you're asking a question.
What is the, can you hear me?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Oh, you're on mute again. Or if you'd like, you can type into the chat. We can't hear you. Yeah. Vanessa, I had a follow-up question while she's typing. So the B project, did I hear that correctly, that this is part of a curriculum that is in health class for students, and this is all of Dallas ISD?
We work in Dallas ISD, Grand Prairie ISD, and Carrollton Farmers Branch ISD. So not every single school in those districts by any means has us in their classes. We would need a staff of like 200 people. It would be crazy. But the handful of schools that we're in, if you're in health class at that school, you do have us for basically the whole semester. So we're in a handful of schools in each of those districts, but we're working on expanding within Dallas ISD for this upcoming school year.
Okay.
Any other questions? All good? All right. We will move right along to basically all of the kind of 101 information about relationship violence. I've got, about DV, domestic violence up here, but a lot of what we're about to go through applies to all kinds of partner and gender-based violence. So the definition that we use for domestic violence, dating violence, intimate partner violence, all the things are just a pattern of behavior that is being used to manipulate, control you, gain some sort of power over you, make you feel afraid or guilty. And so that can look like a lot of things. We have this power and control wheel over here on the right. And this is kind of an example, like big over, you got umbrella kind of categories of tactics that will be used to gain power and control over somebody. So things like minimizing, denying, and blaming. This is where we get into your kind of, emotional abuse, gaslighting, those types of things, where, when you confront somebody about the way they've harmed you, they might minimize by saying like, oh, it wasn't really that big a deal. You might be blowing things out of proportion. You're just being dramatic. It really wasn't that, serious. They might deny it and say, well, I never did that. Right? You just must not be remembering this correctly because I never said that, or I never did that thing. Or they may even blame you and say, well, I only hit you because you did X, Y, and Z, right? I only acted this way. You made me, you forced me to do this. So that one is super, super common. I feel like that's where a lot of abuse starts, is just with that minimizing, denying, and blaming before it escalates into other forms. So that's one I really like to talk about because it can kind of be a warning sign, right? When your arguments or conflicts with a partner involve a lot of minimizing, denying, and blaming, that's a sign that things can kind of only get worse from there. Are there other categories here on the power and control wheel that stand out to you, that you've got questions or thoughts about, maybe an example? It's okay if not.
I have a question about intimidation.
Yeah.
So if you can give examples of that, please.
Yeah. So intimidation, this is kind of going back to this definition over here of, making someone feel afraid. Intimidation could be something where you're just using your physical presence to intimidate someone, to stand over them, to maybe block them. Like if you're in an argument and they're trying to just leave the room and leave that situation, maybe you block the doorway. That could be an intimidating thing. It could involve threats and intimidation can kind of go hand in hand of, if you try to tell somebody, if you try to report this, if you try to leave, I'm going to do all these things. Intimidation can be physical, it can be verbal. It's just anything to kind of make you think twice about whatever it was you were going to do, whatever it was you were going to try. Maybe I shouldn't do this because of how this person's going to react.
Okay, so would a weapon also go under the category of intimidation?
Yeah, absolutely. When abusers, we know that having a firearm in the household increases the risk, the lethality risk within domestic violence 500%. And we will see sometimes that abusers will kind of not say that I have this gun, I could shoot you, but they'll just be kind of they'll be very visible to their victim about having that gun, pulling it out so that their victim can see that they have that gun. So that kind of thing, where it's very subtle intimidation, where I'm not saying anything directly, I'm not doing anything directly to you, but you're aware that I have this and I could hurt you with it. Absolutely. It's a really good example.
Thank you.
Vanessa, I was going to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on using children. This is something that from my work as a counselor with survivors of intimate partner violence that sometimes they don't recognize it until they've left the relationship. So everyone's encouraging, women and men who are being abused, leave the relationship. And they do that. And this part of using children can sometimes at that point become really clear. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Children, just kind of at the most surface level, children can be used as a tool to keep somebody in that relationship of if you were to leave, kind of using that guilt of, well, how would this affect our kids, if you left, if we got a divorce. So using that guilt of how the children could be affected by this, even threatening to kind of turn children against one parent. We can see that. Custody issues, especially where using children and social status can kind of go together. We've had some clients that we've worked with who we've had, especially women who were the victim in an abusive relationship. They also had some mental health issues, and they were often married to men, their abusers, who had positions of power, whether that was, like a really kind of prominent public facing job, where we've seen multiple times where that job and the custody of the children are kind of used in tandem to keep a person trapped in that relationship of, if you try to leave me, like, who do you think the court is going to award custody to with your history of mental illness or things like that. So there's lots of ways that children get used to manipulate outcomes by abusers. Yeah. Any others that stand out to folks? All good? All right. So there are, lots of different types of abuse. This is kind of the 6 main ones that we talk about, with sexual abuse, financial, digital, emotional, physical, and stalking. These are our big categories. And there's overlap with many of these for sure, which we'll get into. For physical abuse, it's not just like kind of what pops into our head very traditionally, this idea of hitting someone or shoving somebody around. It can also be punching walls or other objects, blocking someone from leaving a space. It's that using your presence, whether you're physically putting your hands on somebody or not, when you're using that physical presence to intimidate someone, to control them, to show that you have power over them in some way. With sexual abuse, this is the way we define it. I'll say this does not mirror like legal definitions of sexual abuse. And that's a blanket statement for almost all of these, is that I'm not using legal definitions. Legal definitions are very restrictive. And if we only went by legal definitions, then we'd be kind of erasing the experiences of lots of people who absolutely have experienced violence, but don't meet any sort of legal threshold for it, right? So that's my kind of disclaimer. So we consider sexual abuse any unwanted sexual activity, right? Anything unwanted. That is groping, unwanted touching, that is rape and sex assault, that's reproductive coercion. And the way we define consent is a clear voluntary agreement for a specific sexual activity during a specific sexual encounter. So that means that I am consenting to do this particular thing with you right now. Because I've given consent for this right now doesn't mean I also consent to that thing again in the future, right? So consent is a very time-based process. We got to get brand new consent for every sexual, encounter we ever have the rest of our lives. That's basically how it works. So sexual abuse is when any of these things are happening and consent isn't present. I won't play this video just because I want to be able to get through as much content as possible, but this is a fun video that I highly recommend folks watching, pulling it up on your own time, especially if you have kids, if you have teenagers. This is a great way of understanding consent. It's very fun and very silly and very lighthearted, but it's just the best a kind of example of consent I've ever seen. There's also a version of this called Consent for Kids, and it's for like young children. Like if you've got kids who are 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, it's appropriate for them. So just want to plug this T-consent video because it's fantastic. With emotional and verbal abuse, this is any of our non-physical behaviors. So this is where, like we talked about in the power and control wheel, we've got our threats, our insults, the minimizing, denying, and blaming. We didn't talk much about isolation, but when, you know, you're kind of working to separate a person from their support system, from their friends, from their family members. We see this when, you know, an abusive partner kind of guilts you for going out with your friends and not spending all of your time with them, right? Trying to cut you off. And that isolation really serves to just make you more and more dependent on your partner, on your abuser. So that then if you ever did want to leave or get help, you've kind of cut off your support system and you don't have many people to turn to, and it creates that dependency on that partner. Stalking is like the trickiest form of abuse because it's probably the hardest to prove. And stalking is kind of in this interesting area where behaviors that could be considered stalking are also sometimes totally fine and innocuous and harmless. So for example, sending gifts. If you are in a loving relationship with your partner and everything is great, you probably enjoy receiving gifts from that person, at least, you know, like on your birthday, like, you know, it's like, it's a normal thing. Like we like getting things from the people that we love. But if maybe you have ended a relationship, maybe the receiving those gifts, even after you've ended the relationship, that's when this person clearly isn't respecting that boundary that you've set in ending that relationship, and they're not respecting that distance or that space, and they're trying to reestablish some sort of something with you, especially if it's a situation where because of stalking or because of the abuse, you've had to relocate, and you obviously don't want that person to know where you're living or where you're working. Receiving those gifts can sometimes be a way of them saying, I still know where you are, I can still find you. So stalking is in this kind of tricky area where sometimes the things are good and wanted, and then suddenly they are not, and that's when it's stalking. And this is actually a legal definition here for stalking: the pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I know that like just sounds like a lot of words, and that's because stalking is so difficult to pin down. In our work with teenagers, we've had lots of situations of the just kind of showing up at a place where you know somebody's going to be. Like if I know this person that I've been trying to get with is going to be done with track practice at 4:30, I'm in the parking lot by their car waiting for them at 4:30 when I know they're going to have to come to their car after track practice. So that's just like being somewhere, or reaching out to your family and friends saying like, hey, I haven't heard from so-and-so in a while. Could you, give me their number? Have you been hanging out with them lately? Looking at somebody's social media to see where they are and what they've been doing and who they've been with. Lots and lots of things that can go into stalking. And digital abuse, this one here, this is digital abuse can involve verbal and emotional abuse. It can be used in stalking. It can be, you can even have, sexual abuse that's taking place online. There's all kinds of things, but digital abuse is just when those things are happening through the use of technology. So using technology to track or monitor someone, like we said, like just checking in on your social media to kind of see where you've been and who you've been hanging out with, or enabling actual location services, or requiring that your partner share their location with you 24/7. We see a lot with teenagers and unfortunately adults, partners trying to set rules around who you're allowed to follow on Instagram and how you shouldn't be following the influencers in their swimsuit pictures or whatever, right? So trying to control who you're talking to in your DMs, who you're following, those types of things. any persistent requests that are unwanted to send explicit pictures or videos, that pressure to send those, insisting that you share passwords with a partner so that they can go into your social media and make sure you're not talking to whoever they don't want you to be talking to, that kind of thing. We see especially when folks get real kind of panicky about answering their phone, like when their partner calls and it's like, I have to answer this immediately, otherwise they're going to be mad at me. Like that's some digital abuse involved, that expectation that you're going to be available to me whenever I want you to be. So this is another kind of tricky one that can look lots of different ways. So all of these types of abuse kind of occur in what we call this cycle of abuse. And this is one thing that works to keep folks trapped in these relationships. So the honeymoon phase is probably pretty obvious. It's when everything is sunshine and rainbows and we're so happy and we're so in love, everything's great. But then over time in all relationships, right, the honeymoon phase wears off. This is when tensions build. Maybe there are little behaviors that are frustrating or maybe even a little worrisome. This is where things, are starting to move from like a green light into a yellow light kind of territory. And if you've got some really good communication skills and really good conflict skills, we can work back into that green light territory. But if we don't have those skills, yellow light can turn into red light, where we hit the explosion. And that is where, an abusive incident occurs. And then of course, because this is a cycle, at some point we get from that explosion where something bad has happened, we get back into that honeymoon phase. And I wanted to ask y'all, feel free to chime in, unmute, or put in the chat, what are some of those tactics that somebody might use to get from the explosion back into that honeymoon phase where everything is fine and great?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
They can buy gifts and say, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, apologizing, buying gifts. What else? Anyone else?
I was going to say, the one I'm familiar with is like promising to change, saying I made an appointment with a counselor, or I made an appointment with, a pastor, or I promise I'll do that.
Yep. That's the one that always comes first to mind for me, is the I promise it'll never happen again. I promise I'll change. I'm working on myself. It'll never happen. Those kinds of assurances, right? And through that and their apology and maybe getting you gifts, all of those things, right? We work back into that phase where we're like, okay, it wasn't really that bad. It's okay. This person, they're not going to do it again. It's going to be better from now on. And then the cycle just starts up again, right? This cycle is also why it takes people anywhere from like 5 to 9 attempts to successfully leave an abusive relationship. Because once you try, they do something to pull you back in. So it can take quite a few times for folks to successfully leave an abusive relationship. It's also why we have folks in our shelter who are repeat clients, where they were with us for a while, felt like they were really going to leave. When they left shelter, inevitably got back with that person. A couple months later, they're back here in shelter again, because it's hard. Abusers are really, really good at bringing you back in and making you believe that, they're going to change and it's not going to happen again and they're going to get better. There's another cycle that I like to talk about, which is this intergenerational cycle of violence. So outside of the context of one specific relationship and the things happening there are these larger patterns that we replicate throughout our lives. So we've got adult intimate partner violence. When children in a home are exposed to that violence, right now they have, they've seen parents maybe who are behaving violently in some way. They then are more likely to carry out that violence as they get older. This is where, I don't know about y'all, but I know when I was a kid and we would talk about bullying or some kid who was being a bully, teachers and grownups would always say things like, oh, well, they probably have something going on at home, right? There's something else that's driving that behavior. And that's what we see with bullying and peer aggression through our kind of, childhood and early teen years, is that children who are exposed to violence in the home are more likely to then enact that violence, to be aggressive with their peers. And we know that young people who are bullies and who are aggressive with their peers are more likely to engage in teen dating violence once they begin dating. So those interactions that they were doing just amongst their, classmates then get put into the romantic relationships as they start engaging in romantic relationships, and then engaging in that makes them more likely to carry it out as an adult, once again, kind of moving this cycle along. So that's why what we do with like youth prevention work is so crucial. We're hoping to be able to kind of stop that cycle at a point before it just continues on and on again. That's the goal. That's what we're trying to do, and it's tricky. But yeah, so this cycle, it just kind of, it feeds into itself in this never-ending kind of way. Any comments or questions about this cycle? All good. All right. Here we go. Oh, actually, this is where I want to give you all some options of what we want to do. We kind of got through the DV 101 and the services. So now we can talk about groups who are at particularly high risk. We can talk about where perpetration comes from, where violence comes from. We can talk about prevention and youth, or how to help a friend who might be going through this. Is there anything that stands out to y'all that y'all want to start with one of those?
The prevention.
The prevention piece? Okay. That's my favorite too. Okay.
I was going to vote for, after that one, if we can do a little bit of what makes a perpetrator. I think that would be interesting.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good too.
I was going to say that too.
Let's do both, because the what makes a perpetrator is going to kind of help understand the prevention conversation. So we'll start here and we'll do both of those.
Okay, great.
All right. So what makes a perpetrator? On that individual level, there's that need for power and control, right? That is what's driving abuse in an individual relationship, is that I'm trying to control you in some way. I'm trying to exert power over you in some way. So that's kind of the drive at that individual level. But I think a better question than what is driving this behavior for this one person is, why is this happening in a widespread way? Right? Why does violence happen at all? Violence happens when the conditions for violence are right. Risk factors are what we call those conditions. Risk factors are conditions that make violence more likely to happen, not just for you as an individual, but at a community or societal level. So risk factors are like a recipe, right? You get all those things in there, violence happens. So we're going to kind of dive into those risk factors, all the conditions or the recipe for violence. So the recipe, the model that we use to understand risk and protective factors. So risk factors make violence more likely to happen. Protective factors make violence less likely to happen. So we use this model, the social ecological model. This is where the public health theory comes in. This is a public health piece of information. So we have these 4 levels, and this model can be used to describe any health problem, whether that's domestic violence or childhood obesity or diabetes or cancer or whatever, right? It applies to everything, smoking, all of it. So at the individual level, we have all the things about you as a person. At the relationship level, we have everything about the people in your immediate sphere of influence. First and foremost, your family of origin, your friends, your coworkers. Then we have the community level, which is where we have institutions, right? It could be your school, your workplace, your neighborhood, your place of worship, any of those institutions that you're a part of. And then at the largest level, we have society. This is where we're looking at social norms that make violence more or less likely to happen. Pieces of policy, like actual legislation, that can make violence more or less likely to happen. And even our media, what's being said on the news, what's being said in the the music that we listen to, in the movies that we watch that could make violence more or less likely to happen. So there are factors at every single level that are intertwined and working on every single one of us all the time. And it's why prevention is really tricky, because how can you possibly address all of these factors, right? And the answer is you can't. So you got to prioritize. To get a little bit deeper into what those risk factors are, once again, if we're thinking about what makes a perpetrator, these risk factors are the things at an individual level that are going to make violence more likely. These down here are the things that make violence less likely. You'll also see that a lot of these, they can apply to people of all ages. Some can be kind of specific to youth and adolescents and young adults, just because our attitudes and beliefs are being formed during adolescence, right? We don't change a ton once we're grown-ups from like deeply rooted personal convictions, right? We're always growing, we're always learning, we're always changing, but a lot of that identity formation that happens in adolescence is what drives this. So at the individual level, if you have been exposed to violence in your home, of course, that increases your risk. If you have really poor social problem solving skills, meaning that you don't really have constructive, healthy ways of dealing with conflict, if you don't really have many friends, if you believe in really strict gender roles, if you hold beliefs that are accepting of violence, all of those kind of personal attitudes, beliefs, history make violence more likely to occur for that person on the end of perpetration, right? So this is all about perpetration. Then protective factors, we know that folks who really prioritize academic achievement and a positive social orientation, meaning that they kind of work toward having positive social relationships. That's a priority for them. And just high social and emotional skills. Those things all make a person less likely to behave violently. At the relationship kind of level, we have those unhealthy family interactions, right? If you are coming from a family where people don't know how to communicate in a healthy way, you don't really ever have the opportunity to learn any different, right? You're just going to have those unhealthy communication skills as your default. Associating with aggressive peers, this is, all of your friends think it's cool to slap girls on the rear with a yardstick. So why wouldn't that be okay for you to do as well, right? If all of your friends are doing it, then what's the problem? Experiencing physical discipline. I know this is like a controversial one, especially here in Texas, but physical discipline is associated with later in life violence perpetration. Low commitment to school and low emotional attachment to caregivers. So kind of thinking about this relationship level, if you don't feel connected to the people in your life, you don't really feel much of an obligation to put work into those relationships, right? If you don't feel connected, you don't feel like you need to be nice and respectful. But on the flip side of that, if you have strong social networks, if you have connection to caring adults in your lives, if you feel comfortable going to your parents with any problems you might be experiencing, all of those things make you less likely to behave violently. So when we can have our adolescents surrounded with positive relationships at school, at home, in the community, with positive role models, then they're less likely to behave violently. And like probably none of this sounds like earth-shattering to anyone. It's pretty, it makes a lot of sense, right? That when we have the support we need, we don't lash out, right? At the community level, this is where we start looking at kind of systems level factors that increase or decrease the likelihood of violence. So high rates of poverty increase the likelihood of violence in a community. When it comes to like domestic violence in particular, we know that when a man loses his job, the risk of him behaving violently to his family increases dramatically. There's something about economic security and being a provider that is tied into our understandings of masculinity, that then when kind of triggered can be an impetus for violence. Communities that don't have much in terms of educational opportunities, of forming connection, of growing and improving as a community, violence once again is more likely to happen. Weak sanctions against partner violence is one I like to talk about in here. weak sanctions doesn't mean that your community loves violence. That doesn't mean that we're just like, you know what, partner violence, that's okay with me. It's more that we're just not responding to it in the way that we should. And my favorite example, are y'all familiar with Brock Turner? Have y'all heard that name, know who that is? Okay, I know Lisa says yes. So for anyone who doesn't, Brock Turner was a college student who raped an unconscious an unconscious college student behind a dumpster at a frat party. And there was no question or doubt about what he did. There were witnesses, very straightforward case. This woman was unconscious. Obviously, she can't consent. Lots of people saw him do it, right? Very clear cut. And in the state where this happened in California, the mandatory minimum sentence for this crime should have been 2 years in federal prison. But young Brock Turner was a very talented swimmer on track to compete in the Olympics one day. And the judge felt like it would be a shame to hurt this boy's really bright future. So instead of going with the mandatory minimum, he gave him only 6 months in county jail, and he only ended up serving 3 of those 6 months and before he was let out for his good behavior. That is an example of weak sanctions against violence, right? Was he punished? Yeah, technically. But it also kind of feels like a slap on the wrist in a lot of ways, right? And it communicates to victims of these crimes kind of that you don't matter and that your experiences aren't severe enough for other people to care, right? It also kind of makes folks feel like, why should I report it at all, right? Because really nothing came of this. So those weak sanctions are one of the #1 community level factors that make violence more likely to happen. When people can see that you get away with violence, even when you have witnesses with nothing but a slap on the wrist, then what's stopping you from behaving that way, right? On the flip side, for protective factors, when you have neighborhood collective efficacy, meaning that your neighborhood or your community has a strong connection to advocate for themselves, to create change. Those types of communities will see less violence, or when they do see violence, they'll respond to it in ways that limits the recurrence of violence again in the future. When we're able to coordinate resources and services, when we have access to stable housing, when we have access to the medical care that we need, the mental health care that we need, when communities are supported, there is less violence. And then at the societal level, this is where we're looking at like social norms and policies that influence violence. So really strict gender role norms, gender inequality, all of those things drive violence. Income inequality drives violence. Inequality of literally any kind drives violence, because we know violence is about power, right? If we think about the power and control wheel, at the end of the day, it's about power. And if any group has more power than another at a societal level, the groups without power will experience disproportionate amounts of that violence, because it's about power at the end of the day. When we have those weak policies and laws around the health, education, economic, and social issues from our community level, right? If we're talking about housing and economic opportunity and access to healthcare, that's all influenced by policies. Those are laws, and we can make laws that make violence less likely to happen. So the protective factors are the opposite of all those scary things, right? Gender equality, racial and ethnic equality, income equality, like all of those things make violence less likely to occur. The top 2 risk factors out of all those very complicated list of things are that prior exposure to violence and adherence to strict gender roles. Those are the top 2 that pop up in the research the most. Of those individual level factors that drastically increase a person's likelihood of behaving violently. The strict gender roles, for those of you that are really interested in that kind of like behavioral psychology, sociology kind of stuff, there is a research scale called Hostility Toward Women. It's a 30-item scale, kind of like a questionnaire or a survey. And the more of the statements on that scale you agree with, the direct correlation to the likelihood of you having perpetrated sexual assault. I mean, it's just like those are interwoven in an inseparable kind of way. So highly recommend looking into the Hostility Toward Women's scale. It's a great research tool. Let's see. Okay, now we're going to look at the prevention side of it. So there are 3 strategies that have been used kind of throughout the history of the domestic and sexual violence movements to prevent violence or to try to end this violence. Normally I'd have everybody guess at what you think these mean, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to tell you. So awareness, this is where we started kind of as a movement, where we thought, you know, if people just knew how common it was, if people just knew how the victims are affected, right, then it would stop, which unfortunately isn't the case, right? So that awareness raising is just, you know, how common is it? Who is affected by this? What does it look like? Basically, everything we've talked about today until we talked about risk factors was awareness, making sure that people know about the community resources available to them. That's all awareness education, which unfortunately does not prevent violence. It's great for rallying people to a cause. If you're trying to recruit volunteers or donors, awareness is a great strategy. So not super helpful at reducing violence. The next strategy that we employed was risk reduction. And this is the way probably all of us on this call were raised. It was everything that we were taught about how to protect ourselves, how to not be a victim. We were taught to cover our drink at a party, to use the buddy system, not to go out at night, don't trust the creepy guy in the white van with candy, stranger danger, all these things, right? That's risk reduction, is what can you do to not be a victim? Once again, not super effective, because there is nothing that I can personally do to control the behavior of other people. If somebody wants to hurt me bad enough, they are going to, right? There's very little I can do to control other people's actions. So primary prevention is kind of the evidence-based strategy that we're using right now. It is not about teaching you to not be a victim. It is about teaching every single person not to be a perpetrator. And we do that by working to decrease risk factors, especially those that are just your own personal attitudes and beliefs about gender, about violence. We do that by increasing protective factors. So how can we increase social support, increase social emotional skills? And the ultimate goal of prevention is behavior and structural change. We're trying to change our behaviors at individual and relationship levels, and we're trying to create that structural change at the community and societal levels. So awareness, just like all of us on this call right now, are probably aware of what a healthy diet looks like. We know why we should be eating a healthy diet. We know what bad things could happen to our body if we don't, but that awareness is not enough to drive us to actually eating a 100% healthy diet all the time. Like all of us on here probably eat some Whataburger every now and then, right? So awareness is not enough to shift our behavior, and primary prevention is aimed at that, of behavior change. So that introduces this challenge of how just teaching people about violence, right? Unfortunately, not effective at preventing that violence, right? Because awareness doesn't really move people to change their deeply held beliefs. So effective prevention work.
I have to go, but thank you. I appreciate this.
Farewell.
I have a meeting at 3. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Gotcha. Bye, friend.
Bye.
All right. So our effective prevention work, right, is working to target the risk and protective factors. And prevention is rooted in these social justice principles, right? When we were going through all the risk and protective factors, you probably noticed things like access to healthcare, access to safe and affordable housing, all of these things around inequality. So addressing these factors is all kind of oriented in this social justice framework, working on these, prejudiced attitudes, working on these structural issues. All of that is prevention work, which is why any social justice work is violence prevention. If you are, doing some work on racial justice in your community, that's automatically violence prevention. If you're working to create affordable senior housing, that's violence prevention. Anything you're doing that's social justice oriented is automatically preventing violence. some CDC recommended strategies for violence prevention, and these are all youth oriented because, like I said, we're targeting behavior change. Grown-ups not good about changing behavior, but we can try with kids, right? So we have the risk factors in this column, then whatever strategy is recommended for addressing that risk factor, and then whatever the approach is. How do we approach that strategy So if a risk factor is not really having those healthy conflict skills, then the strategy is that we need to teach safe and healthy skills. And the way that you do that is through social emotional learning programs for youth, right? So this is one example. If we know that harmful gender and other social norms are a risk factor, then we need to teach those safe and healthy relationship skills. We need to teach, which involves those norms, right? Healthy relationship skills involves having healthier ideas about gender and about race and about people who are different from us, which once again can be accomplished through social emotional learning programs. If we're looking at the protective factors of how just connection to school and connection to a caring adult reduces the likelihood of violence, then what we can do is create protective environments. We need our kids to feel safe at school. We need our kids to feel safe at home. And so one strategy for that is just improving school climate. We actually know that among groups who are at the most risk of violence are also the groups who are the least likely to feel connected to their school community. So that is Black and Indigenous women, that is LGBTQ folks, that is folks with disabilities. Those are the highest risk groups of experiencing violence, and they're the groups that are least likely to feel a sense of belonging to their school. So we've got to really bolster that sense of belonging, that connection, and that is what reduces violence. So if we want to kind of keep our kids safe, we really just have to make sure that they feel safe with us as the adults in their lives, that they, know that they can come to us with their problems without us just flying off the handle and getting mad at them, right? So connection to a caring adult doesn't just mean like knowing my mom loves me. It's knowing that I can take this very scary problem to my mom, one in which maybe I've even made some mistakes or broken some rules, and know that mom is going to support me and take care of me and work to make me feel safe before she goes into all the rules that I broke and how I am the problem, right? So that is what we're looking for with our teens, is that they know that first and foremost, they're going to be safe and supported. And all the other scary stuff can come after we know we are safe and supported. And that goes for family, that goes for school. Any questions about these? These are just like a handful of examples. All good. Okay. I think I'm going to pull back from there because I know we are now at our 1 hour mark. So I want to just see if anybody's got other questions, any other comments? I don't know. Where are we at? How are we feeling?
Yeah, getting help. I understand helping a friend, but is there a way to actually volunteer to help?
Let's see. So working directly with clients is not something that volunteers can do because of confidentiality concerns. But there are volunteer opportunities within our agency. So things that could still be like doing things in our shelter, for our shelter, things like that, but you won't be working like directly with clients because once again, we've got confidentiality issues there. So plenty of opportunities to volunteer. Just calling our main line, which is conveniently at the bottom of the screen. That's kind of the best way to start with just volunteer stuff there, is to go through that line. Trying to think of other. Actually, we don't use volunteers for this, but rape crisis centers use volunteers to work hotline shifts. Because rape crisis centers are typically smaller agencies that can't afford to have a full-time hotline staff. So those are often very volunteer driven. So I would check with, if you're kind of Dallas area, the Dallas area Rape Crisis Center. If you're more toward like Denton, then there's Denton County Friends of the Family. If you're a Collin County person, there's the Turning Point Rape Crisis Center. So all those rape crisis centers are really good if you want to like really genuinely help people individually. Hotline work is where volunteers are usually taken for those. Any other questions?
Yeah, this is tremendously helpful. And yes, I would keep you on here for the rest of the day. Just
I mean,
presenting
I can do it all day.
so much. It's you know, and the way that you present the information is so helpful, and so real and very good. And I love how, you know, you talk about, like in class, you know, some of the issues are a micro perspective and some are that macro perspective, those structures. So that's incredibly helpful. But I also want to be respectful of your time. And so yes, we did discuss an hour. Yeah, and just Vanessa, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your expertise with us. And I always feel like this information is life-changing, and you know, you never know who it's going to impact at a personal level. And so thank you so much for doing this for the community and for us today.
Absolutely.
Thank
This
you.
was fun. Yeah.
Thank you so
All
much.
right.
You're welcome.
Well, have a great day, everybody.